visitors who are from out of town. Jeremy just handed me a note. We have squeezed 313 people into this building this morning. So we're so glad to have so many of you here. I know that a lot of you are here because you were bringing kids down to go to college and helping them to get moved in. And we hope we can be of service to you and encouragement to you. Incidentally, for those of you who are college students or young adults, and I will leave that purely your discretion to define yourself as such, you are all invited to come over to my house tonight so we can, first of all, just kind of get together and check in with each other and see how our summers went, and also do some planning for our college and young adult class that'll start up in the month of September. So you're invited to come. I know a lot of you old timers know how to get there. If you'd like to come, I'll be glad to give you my address so you can put it in Google Maps and make your way to the house. I'm so thankful for the wonderful work that was done while I was away last week by John Haley, who taught class, which is, to me, the most difficult thing to do is to fill in and teach a class somebody else is teaching and use their material. So I really appreciate his willingness to do that. And also appreciate the wonderful job that Ethan did and that Austin did. I know Ethan has preached here a couple of times. I think maybe, Austin, was that your first official sermon last Sunday night? And I can assure you, your first sermon was a much better effort than my first sermon. Now, I was quite a bit younger than you, and I didn't have me to help, all right? So, but just after my 16th birthday, I preached my very first sermon, which was on Romans chapter 12. All of it. All of Romans chapter 12. And I mean, just imagine in the 25 minutes or so that I spoke, just how rich, deep, and substantive that sermon had to be as I covered the entire chapter. Well, my goal this morning is in sort of a throwback to preach from the same chapter, but I'm only going to try to cover 2 verses, and it's going to take a lot longer than 25. No, I'm just teasing. But I do want to talk with you about these first 2 verses. I'm actually this morning trying to answer 2 sermon requests at once in one fell swoop. First of all, I think week before last, Phil Hunt sent me an email asking me to do a lesson on transformation because, as a lot of you all know, he spends a lot of time on Sunday afternoon studying with people who are incarcerated and who need to be encouraged about the possibility of transformation. So that's one request. And then the other request, on Wednesday night, one of our elders said that he wished I would preach sermons with 2 points. So this is going to be a 2-point lesson tonight, this morning, and they're going to come right out of Romans chapter 12. Verse 1 is going to be the first point, which is to offer yourself to God as a living sacrifice. And verse 2 is going to be the second point, which is to be transformed and not conformed. So let's just get right to it here. Point number 1, offer yourself to God. So here's how my Bible starts verse 1. It says, I appeal to you, brothers. Yours may say something like, I urge you, I beseech you, I plead with you. You get the idea from all those translations that this is an intense, solemn, urgent summons that Paul is making here. It's particularly important because of what is motivating it. He says, I appeal to you, brothers, by the mercies of God. Paul makes this appeal based on the mercies, plural. We know that the Bible says a lot about the mercy of God, but it's almost as Paul is saying, mercy is such a part of God, and we have all experienced the mercy of God in so many different ways. I can't just talk about the mercy of God. I have to make this appeal on the basis of the mercies, plural, of God. And if you're familiar at all with what comes before this appeal, you understand why he uses the word therefore. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God. The therefore is there because Paul is drawing a conclusion based on what he has just said. I think he especially has in mind the previous 3 chapters, 9, 10, and 11, all of which center on this question. If God chose Israel as his chosen people, which he did, If God blessed Israel with the gift of the scriptures, with the covenant, with the temple, with the prophets and the promises, if all of that is the case, why is it that most of those who are of Israel have not accepted Jesus as the Messiah? So as Paul begins to answer that question, if you look with me in chapter 9, he says, I want to tell you what God is doing. God is doing with Israel what he did with Pharaoh. Israel is faithless. Pharaoh was faithless. God is going to exploit and take advantage of Israel's lack of faith like he did Pharaoh by hardening both of them. And then by hardening them, use that hardening as an opportunity to show off, you might say, to display his great power so that other people will come to know about God. In the case of Pharaoh, it happens through the series of plagues, and especially the Exodus. So here's how Paul puts it. This is chapter 9 and verse 15. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. So then it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God who has mercy. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I've raised you up, that I might show my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. So then he has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills. Think, for example, how does Rahab, the Canaanite Gentile, come to know about the one true God? What does she tell the spies when they come into Jericho in Joshua 2? We've heard about what God did. We've heard about what God did in Egypt. You see, the point is that God is going to use Pharaoh's unbelief, harden him in that unbelief, and then display his great power so that the end result will be the word will go out and more people will come to know God and more people will receive God's mercy. Paul is saying that's exactly what God is doing with Israel. So think about it. We just studied the book of Acts. Paul's typical plan, he goes into a city, first place he goes, synagogue, if he can find one. Preaches the gospel in the synagogue to those who are Jewish. What's the response? Well, there are a few who believe, but most of them reject the gospel. And then what always happens? Then Paul turns to the Gentiles, and what's the response like among them? It's much more accepting of the gospel, so that now these Gentiles are receiving mercy. As Paul starts to wind up this discussion in chapter 11, here's how he pulls all the threads together. This is the reason I wanted to include these verses along with Romans 12, 1 and 2 in our reading for today. So he says in chapter 11 and verse 30, just as you, that is you Gentiles, were at one time disobedient to God, but now have received mercy because of their disobedience. I came to preach to Jews, they reject it, then I go to Gentiles, you've responded and received mercy. He says in verse 31, so they too have now been so disobedient, in order that by the mercy shown to you, they also may now receive mercy. It may just be that as these Jews see the blessings of the Messiah spread to Gentiles, they'll go, hey, I want some of that. Maybe I should rethink who Jesus is. Maybe I should respond to the gospel. For, verse 32, God has consigned all to disobedience that he may have mercy on all. You see how many times he said mercy? It's 4 times just right here at the end of chapter 11. I therefore appeal to you by the mercies of God. See what the appeal is based on? It's based on all of these references to the mercy of God in the previous 3 chapters. And so on the basis of that, here is the appeal or the urgent request in verse 1. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, which ordinarily would be a contradiction in terms, right? In the Old Testament, in the book of Leviticus, when it talks about sacrifices, well, the animal's alive when it's being brought up to the tabernacle or then the temple, and it's alive when it's brought to the priest, but it's not alive for much longer. That's the whole point of a sacrifice, is it's offered, it's killed, its blood is shed, it's dedicated to God as a holy offering and gives its life. But as you might remember from our Wednesday night class, remember there was a deeper purpose behind these sacrifices. The deeper purpose was that by giving the animal, The one who gives it is saying to God, I am pledging my life to you. Take this animal as a symbol of my broken and contrite heart. That's why David says in Psalm 51, you will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. You would not be pleased with a burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. Now, the point here is not to belittle the sacrifices. The Bible certainly says a lot about them in Leviticus and other places. But what David is saying is that the ultimate purpose of these sacrifices was to express to God the desire of the worshiper to be one with God, to offer himself to God, to dedicate his life to God. And what Paul is saying is that just as an animal was offered as a dead sacrifice to represent the commitment that the one offering it is making to God, that we are offering ourselves to God as the ultimate way to express our commitment to him as a living sacrifice. And the way that Paul expresses this idea of committing ourselves is to present your bodies as a living sacrifice. Now, we have a problem in the culture that we have grown up in that we tend to dissect what it means to be human to the point that sometimes we talk as if, well, the real me is what's on the inside. And this body of mine, well, this body, it's just a tool that I use, but it's not the real me. Well, that's not the way the Bible pictures it. And really, when you get right down to it, that's not even what we really think either. Like, for example, if I walked down here and I took your pencil and I broke it, you wouldn't say, you broke me, you would say, I broke your pencil. But if I took your arm, let me have your arm. No, I'm just teasing. If I took your arm and snapped it, you wouldn't say, oh, you snapped that tool I was using. You would say, why did you hurt me? Right? That's right. Because we understand that our body, it's not just a tool, it's part of me. Now, it's not all that I am, but it is certainly a crucial part of what it means to be human. And when Paul says, present your bodies, he's not saying, well, you give the body to God, but then inside, spiritually or mentally, you can do whatever you want. No, it's not how he thinks. To present your body is to present yourself. And so what Paul is saying is you give yourself completely and totally to God as someone who is sacrificing yourself to dedicate yourself to his purpose, and do so because God has been so merciful to you. That's the way the Bible always works, right? We love because he first loved us. Whatever we do to God, whatever we do in our response to him is always because he has first taken the gracious initiative. And yes, while Paul is saying in this passage that we are to offer ourselves, we are to give everything to God, we are doing so only because he first gave himself to us in Jesus Christ in a sacrifice that is beyond measure or incalculable, inscrutable. We can never plumb the depths of it, as he said there at the end of chapter 11 and verse 33. And once you know how merciful God has been to you, it's only fitting and proper that you should give yourself back to God. And that's what I think Paul means by the very end of the phrase in verse 1, which our translations render a bit differently. How many of your Bibles say, which is your spiritual worship? All right, that's the ESV contingent here. How many of yours say, which is your spiritual service of worship? All right, that's our NASB holdovers here in this congregation. How many say reasonable service? All right, that's our old school King James Version or New King James Version right there. And how many of you say true and proper? All right, that's our smattering of NIV people here. That's right. All right, so those are the different ways. Now, isn't that curious that sometimes our Bibles say spiritual service of worship, sometimes they say reasonable service of worship? Well, let's take the part that's easy first. All of them agree that by offering ourselves to God, we are engaged in a service of worship. reflecting the language of Old Testament sacrifices, which were taken up as a part of the service that was rendered at the temple. And so what Paul is saying is not, hey, you should come to church a couple of times a week. No, what he's saying is the ultimate service of worship that we all render is nothing less than the complete dedication of our entire lives to the will of God. That is our ultimate worship. But why do some of our translations say spiritual service or worship, and others say reasonable service or worship? Well, the Greek word actually looks a lot like our English word logical. And that's why some translations say something like reasonable or rational, because it's logical. And on the other hand, because our rational, logical thought process takes place inwardly in our spirit, that's why some of our Bibles say spiritual. Here's what I think Paul has in mind. If you go all the way back to the very start of this book, in Romans chapter 1, when Paul indicts the Gentile world for its sinfulness, he says this in chapter 1. He says in verse 21, Romans 1:21, for although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images. So he's talking about pagan idolatry here. What I want you to see is this. Paul says that ultimately pagan idolatry is the ultimate brain cramp. It is the ultimate mental defect. Did you notice all of the language here about intellectual processes that have gone bad? In verse 21, it says at the end of verse, they became futile in their thinking. Their foolish hearts were darkened. Verse 22, they were claiming to be wise and they became fools. What Paul is saying here in Romans 1 is this. If you know the truth about who God is, and everybody should, because God has clearly revealed it in creation, He's made it plain. If you know the truth about who God is, it is foolish not to worship Him or honor Him. So that there in chapter 12 and verse 1, when he says this is your reasonable service of worship, what he's saying is, if you know that God is your creator, the only logical, reasonable response is to worship and honor God. That it is the height of foolishness not to worship Him. And then when you tack on to the fact that not only has God created us, but He has also redeemed us by His mercy, then especially in view of the mercies of God, it is absolute nonsense not to worship Him. It's interesting to me that even some of the pagans understood this. One pagan writer put it like this: if I were a nightingale, I should be singing as a nightingale. If a swan, as a swan. But as it is, I am a rational being. And that's this word that we've been talking about in Romans 12. Therefore, I must be singing hymns of praise to God. It's just what is proper and right for me to do as a human being with a mind that can know the truth about who God is. And that's why the NIV says it's what's proper and right. So what Paul is saying is offering yourself as a living sacrifice is just the right thing to do, given who you are and given who God is. Now, before I move on to point number 2, I just want to drive home an application for us this morning. Paul here in this passage says that giving ourselves to God is our rational or reasonable service of worship. Now, I think there is an application to be made for what that means when we come here to our assemblies. In the old days, I used to hear people talk about, I'm going to services. You ever hear that phraseology? Going to worship service. And the implicit meaning of that is, I'm going to render a service. But I don't think that's how we often think of it. To the contrary, I think we more often think of coming here in the same terms as going through the Wendy's drive-thru, or insert your favorite although lesser in quality, fast food drive-through place you want to go to. When I pull through Wendy's drive-through, I'm there to get service, good customer service. I'm there to have it my way, as one other place says. And I think a lot of us, because of our consumer materialistic culture, we transpose that over into what happens, and we come here to get good service. And here is the proof in the pudding. You just think, I'm not asking for a show of hands, but you just think how many times on your way home from here you have said to yourself, or maybe, God forbid, you've spoken out loud, and especially in the presence of your kids, how many times have you said something like, well, I just didn't get much out of that service today? Now, what is the assumption there? I came to get something out of the service here. Now, of course, I understand worshiping God, serving God ought to have an effect on us. It ought to have an impact on us. And we certainly are here to edify each other. But do you understand there is a crucial difference between the mindset that says, first of all, I'm coming here to give service as opposed to I'm coming here to get service. The contrast would be, how many times on your way home have you ever said or thought, boy, I sure just didn't give very much today. I kind of mumbled my way through the singing. And I really wasn't trying to pay attention and focus on what the people who were reading Scripture or talking about Scripture said. And I just wasn't really giving service adequately as we remembered the Lord's death. If we thought more in those terms, we'd be getting a lot more closer to the mindset Paul is talking about here in this passage. But it isn't just simply what we do from 10:30 to 11:30 on Sunday morning. It's a much bigger thing than that. What Paul is talking about here is that you have a mindset as someone who, in response to God's mercy, and certainly because God has made you, you're giving your entire life to Him. You're a living sacrifice. Are you only alive from 10:30 to 11:30? Whenever you're alive, that's when you're offering yourself to God. This is the reason why in American culture we have so many people who call themselves Christians and even go to church occasionally, and the rest of their week live in abject defiance of the lordship of Jesus Christ. Because they assume what it means to offer service to God is to put in a few minutes a week in a pew. That is not what Paul is talking about here. Paul is talking about someone giving their whole life to God, because they know what God has done for them. And if you think that somehow you're putting in your religious time here and the rest of the week is yours, Paul says that doesn't make any sense if you know who God is and you know who you are. So that's point number one. Offer yourself as a living sacrifice to God. Here's point number two, Brother Haley. And point number two is obscured in our English Standard Version. Now, you know I'm an ESV guy, but our verse 2 leaves out the key connecting word. Those of you who are the New American Standard people and the New King James people, your verse 2 starts, and so it's a continuation of a thought. There's a crucial connection between verse 1 and verse 2. And here's the second thought. Here's our second point. Be transformed and not conformed. If we are to offer ourselves to God as we should, we have to be transformed. And the only way that can happen is if we refuse to be conformed, squeezed into the mold of this evil age. And because I am a sophisticated theologian, every time I have read this verse, from the time I preached my very first sermon, I think about silly putty. Now, the other night I was hanging out with the Colleens over here, and Miss Nora was actually playing with silly putty, and I didn't even know they still made this stuff. They still make Play-Doh as well. Lincoln Logs. Well, all is not lost, maybe, in America here, all right? So she was playing with silly putty the other night, and Nora, I was trying to remember what all you made it into. I seem to recall you made a nose at some point. And then I think you made spaghetti, or at least I told you to make some spaghetti. And then I think you made some animals, and I kind of lost track at that point there. But the point is, the silly putty was whatever she wanted it to be. And that's what some people are like. They are whatever the world wants them to be. The world just grabs them, squeezes them, shapes them. That's what they're going to be. And even a lot of people who claim to be Christians, I would say the two greatest threats to being a Christian in our culture are the point I already made, thinking of this as customer service that you come to a few times a week. And then I think the other grave threat to being a Christian in our country is to realize that in our country, what the age we live in says, this is the mold. It's trying to squeeze everybody in. What it's saying to all of us is, all that counts, all that matters, the most important thing is for you individually to be happy. And you individually be happy, regardless of whatever commitments you've made, you be happy. If you're stuck in a boring marriage, you do what makes you happy. If you're single and you want to have sex, you just do what makes you happy. If you've made a commitment that you find challenging to keep, well, you just do what makes you happy. I can't think of any slogan that better captures the age we live in is you do you. Which makes my face want to split apart every time I hear it. Like in this meme I happen to see, be you, do you, for you. Do you know what the gospel says about you doing you? You doing you is a train wreck. Just go back to Romans chapter 1. Here's what you doing you looks like. It looks like a depraved mind. It looks like perverted passions. It looks like those who are faithless, heartless, ruthless. That's what you doing you outside of Jesus Christ looks like. What Paul says is, no, you don't do you. You let God change you and transform you. You can't be a holy and acceptable offering to God and be a living sacrifice at Him and at the same time think you get to dictate terms of service. No, if we're going to be a living sacrifice, then we're going to be transformed. So, Paul says here in verse 2, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed. And I remember, I don't know why this sticks out of my mind. I guess it's because as a little kid in science class, you study this. Years ago, when I first preached from this text, I read that the word here, transformed, is the Greek word that we get the word metamorphosis from. And I'm just curious how many of you, especially some of you kids, as soon as you hear the word metamorphosis, you think about the monarch butterfly. Because that's when I first heard that word when I was a kid, is in class when we studied about how the caterpillar transforms, goes through its metamorphosis, and it becomes a butterfly. Well, Paul says there is a transformation, and when you see it happen, it's even more profound than that. From a caterpillar to a butterfly, there's a transformation that takes place from death to life through the work of Jesus Christ. And yet notice that in verse 2, Paul doesn't say, transform yourself. He says, be transformed, which is passive and meaning somebody else is going to transform you. God, of course, is going to transform you. Maybe he has in mind the language there from the middle of chapter 8 where he says this about God's plan. This is chapter 8, verse 29. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. Rather than being conformed to the world, we're conformed to Jesus, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. And those whom he predestined, he called. Those he called, he justified. Those whom he justified, he also glorified. That's the work of God. We really don't transform ourselves. Christianity is not a pull yourselves up by your own bootstraps religion. The Bible doesn't belong in the self-help section of the bookstore. If it had the right label, it would be, I need help section of the bookstore. That's where the Bible belongs. That's what the story of the gospel is. And yet, at the same time, Paul doesn't say, just sit there and God does everything. The very fact that he says to them, be transformed, that he gives them a command must mean that while it is God who does the work, we must be willing to let God do his work. I was trying to think of an illustration. I'm kind of curious, how many of you here this morning spent time in the armed services of one branch or the other? Raise your hands up big and high so I can see who they are here. All right. So then I've had friends who go away into the service, and you all who actually have gone through this could speak more to this than I can. But here's my observation. It never fails. When I see a friend of mine go into the service, he is a radically different person than he was before he went in. He's transformed. And yet that transformation takes place because of like his drill sergeant or his instructors and trainers, the mess hall, the diet they put him on and everything else. So it's not like he transformed himself, and yet he had to be willing to do what they were telling him to do in order to be transformed. See that? God transforms us, but we have to be willing to offer ourselves up to him so that he can change us. But he doesn't do it by like calisthenics. We don't have to drop and give him 20. Here's how he does it according to verse 2. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Remember in chapter 1, the problem for the Gentiles is their mind is darkened. It's foolish. They lack understanding. They need a new mind. And because they have come to have a change in conviction and believe that Jesus Christ is Lord, now their mind can be renewed. And so then here's what Paul says the result of that is. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern or prove what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Once God transforms you by renewing your mind, you can know what is right and wrong. Here's what I think Paul is getting at. I was trying to think of another illustration here. So when I was a kid, all through my childhood growing up years, my mom was a very heavy smoker. And I didn't think she'd ever quit. It's a tough addiction. What a tough habit to break. But one winter, after I was out of the house, she got bronchitis really bad, and she like literally couldn't smoke because she couldn't breathe. And those few days that she was sick and not able to smoke, it gave her sort of the motivation, hey, maybe I could do this. But she couldn't do it on her own. She needed help to be transformed from a smoker to non-smoker. So she got like the Nicorette gum, and she used that. But she used that gum, and because she was willing to surrender herself to the effort, then she was transformed. But here's the weirdest thing that I saw happen as she quit smoking. Her taste buds dramatically changed. Because while she was smoking, her taste buds were polluted. They were corrupted. They were deadened, and she couldn't really taste what things actually tasted like. If you're trying to break the habit, I would just offer that as one huge motivation. You can actually taste how good food really is. And I remember as a little kid, my mom not only couldn't stand the taste of watermelon, the very smell. If we brought one home and cut it open, she would gag. It grossed her out. And I used to get watermelon chewing gum, this horrible bubble gum that had water. It just absolutely grossed her out in the car when I had it as a little kid. But once she quit smoking, she was transformed. She was willing to let that happen. Her taste buds were renewed. And guess what she couldn't get enough of? She ate watermelon like it was going out of his mouth because she could finally see, oh, this is what's really good. Well, what Paul is saying in this passage is, if you will surrender to God and allow him to transform you and renew your mind, you're going to be able to know what's really good and what isn't. Your spiritual senses will no longer be deadened. They will be renewed. And you will then be able to start to understand, just like my mom figured out that watermelon is good, acceptable, and perfect, you will be able to discern what is the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. But that happens when you yield yourself to him and permit him to transform you through a renewed mind. So Phil, what I would say to the guys you work with is, on the one hand, you must surrender to God, but on the other hand, you don't have to think you're going to do this all on your own. You just have to surrender to let God work through your life. And if you will let him change your heart, then all the rest is going to follow. Now, I asked Max this morning if he would to lead as the invitation song, the song Just As I Am. And I wanted to lead it specifically because of what I was preaching about today. I think it's a beautiful hymn, and it expresses truths that Paul talks about even in this book, like in chapter 5 when he says, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. The point of the gospel is not, if you want to come to God, you've got to get yourself fixed and then you can come to God. No, the point is you've made a wreck of yourself. You can't fix yourself. Come to Jesus just as you are and he will fix you. So that's what the song is going to say. It's what we're going to sing this morning to invite anybody here to respond to the gospel. But here is the thing. What Paul wants us to see in this text today is, while God will take you just as you are, his mercy will not leave you just as you are. It changes you. It transforms you. As he says in 2 Corinthians 3, from glory to glory, till we all with unveiled face behold the glory of the Lord. That's what the Lord's purpose is. And in eternity, praise the Lord, we're not going to rejoice in and remember what we were. We will be just grateful for what we have become through the transforming work of Jesus, the ultimate sacrifice. So this morning, if you recognize, this just makes sense. What you are to do as a human being made in God's image is give yourself to him, because as it says at the end of chapter 11, from him, through him, and to him are all things. And then doubly motivated by the mercy of God, yield yourself to God, permit him to change you, and let us know how we can help while we stand and sing together.